We're here with Dave Kerns, a lifelong Pottstown resident, graduate of Pottstown High School, one of two premier historians of the borough of Pottstown, and currently the president of the Pottstown Historical Society. Dave, you recently had an interesting article in the Historical Society newsletter about the evolution of Memorial Park, which actually starts way back with Pottsgrove Manor. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, of course, it started out with John Potts buying the property off the McCalls. He bought 995 acres. Part of it was Mill Park and part of it was for the town of Pottsgrove, which he called Pottsgrove. And he never got to see the town because he died before the town really materialized. But Mill Park encompassed most of those acres, and he had his mansion built on part of it. And then they eventually, in 1875, they built a racetrack over where Walmart and all those stores are. And later on that became an auto for automobiles. And
so the reason why the West Walnut and West Chestnut and West Beach are sort of in the form of an oval, does that come from the original racetrack?
No, the original racetrack was where Walmart sits now. And then they had a grove there in front of for parking. And also then, you know, it went to the Gable brothers. Eventually in the I guess it was somewhere around the 1850s, the Gable brothers, who lived there on the corner of Hanover and South, where the old freight station sits now, they bought the property and they held on to it all the way up into the 1850s through their estate. It eventually evolved in the early 1900s. It evolved into their descendants. A gentleman from Hemmelwright, I think his name was. He's the one that bought all the property, and through him and all the other sisters, he had all daughters. Gable, the one Gable brother, he had all daughters, so they all married in, and the estate carried it on. And our town fathers actually had to go to Norfolk, Virginia, to ask this Hemmelwright if they could buy the island. They wanted to buy the island for a memorial, and he didn't want to sell it. And then they talked to his wife, and she convinced her husband to sell the island to the town fathers. And then they bought it off Barbara Fitzsimmons, who was another descendant who lived here in town. And eventually they bought the whole park, you know, to make the memorial park.
So we're talking about the land that's more or less north of High Street and west of Manatoni Creek.
The park, eventually, basically what the park is today, they probably bought a few acreage to the I'm trying to think what that would be, the north, towards the north on the Manatoni Creek. But the basic park is what they bought in pieces.
And in what years did that evolve, and who were the town fathers, so to speak?
Well, right after the World War I, there was an organization in town that wanted to make a memorial, and that's where the term Memorial Park comes from. But it never materialized because they could never get the funds for the park together. So then the Rotary Club kind of took it over. The Depression hit, and of course that stopped everything. But then in the 30s, the Rotary Club took it over, and they started getting funds. Some of the funds came from descendants. There was a McCurdy in Port Kennedy that was a descendant that she gave money, a donation to improve the park. Somebody from Bethlehem Steel, I can't remember his name offhand, but somebody from Bethlehem Steel actually got a carload of 900 carloads of dirt from brought in by the railroad and dumped in Memorial Park to level it off and improve the property. But unfortunately, then a flood came in 42 and washed all that away. And then it became a community project. They set up a corporation and different organizations, a bunch of organizations, a group of them got into it. And then that's how, then they went to Norfolk and talked to them, and then they talked to Barbara and they talked to the other descendants, and they finally got together the whole park. And then they had a playground, what they called the Playground Corporation, which was, you know, they put a pool in and put a playground in, and they, you know, different things like that.
Do you know when it was turned over to the actual borough government?
The borough, it was turned over to the borough in the 50s, sometime in the 50s. I don't know the exact year in the 50s, but I'm thinking it was around 55, somewhere in there, when they finally were getting things organized, to, you know, with the corporation that they set up, and the playground group was more or less a borough group, and the borough was involved, but they didn't take it over until the 50s, the mid-50s.
And Pottsgrove Manor, of course, is just south of Memorial Park. And that was, when did that evolve into a hotel and then?
Well, that was around the 1850s again, when the Gable brothers took it over and bought the property. They leased it out as a hotel.
We're talking about John Potts' house.
Yes, yes. They leased it out as a hotel, and it was a hotel all the way up until Mrs. Wendell Potts got involved in the 30s, the late 30s. She got involved in it. She bought the property, or got the property and purchased, and she started making renovations. She wanted to take it back to John Potts' time, but unfortunately, we know that World War II came along, and she couldn't get the materials to do what she wanted to do. So basically all she got was the kitchen done, and then the war came along, and then everything was on hold until the late, you know, the mid 40s, late 40s. But she kept pursuing it, and if it wasn't for her, who knows, it might have been razed or anything like that. You know, she was very instrumental in keeping Pottsgrove Manor and making it what it is today.
So she used her political clout to somewhat to have the state take it over?
She did. She had connections with the governor and right up to the governor. Well, her husband was the headmaster of the Hill School, and she was the actual descendant of the Potts.
So we were talking to Mike Snyder earlier, and he opined that Pottstown really wasn't doing anything until really the railroads came along, and that's when Pottstown really started to grow.
Yeah, they had. I would say the population was 200 to 300 before the railroad really took over. The canal helped, but the canal helped more people in Chester County because it brought Frick's Locks about, Unionville, Pottstown Landing, but we probably did support the canal to a certain extent over here, but you got to remember there was no bridge. It was a ferry across the river and a ford at that time. There was only two ways to get across. It wasn't until 1868 that they built the bridge over at Kime Street, and 1821 when they finally put a bridge across at Hanover Street. So before that there were no bridges to cross. It was either by ford or by ferry. So yeah, the railroads came in the 30s. They started building the railroad. I would say by 1842 it was really picking up, is when it started really picking up. And then of course Henry and David Potts started the roller mill down on Charlotte Street there at the river between Penn and Charlotte there. And that brought men here to work in the mill. That was the first roller mill that was built here, other than, you know, the roller mill we know for the grist mill.
And this roller mill was manufacturing what?
Iron.
And
plate.
it was being used for what?
As far as you know, in the Civil War, they were making plate for ships, iron plates for ships in the Civil War. They basically made iron plate, which would be used in shipbuilding or bridges or anything like that.
And rails, did they make rails?
Yeah, they could make rails, yes.
And then I think the Reading opened a shop here in Pottstown. Did the Reading Railroad?
The Reading Railroad opened shops when the railroad came here. The shops were here till about 1877 when they moved everything to Reading. The shops, the blacksmith shop and was in by York Street at the railroad, and then they had their carpenter shops over there by on South Street between Penn and Charlotte, which March Brownback eventually went into their foundry there. The blacksmith shops over at York were the beginning of the McClintock Marshall, the bridge works. That's where they originated. And then, of course, then they bought the Pottstown Iron Company property later on and moved over there, and then you know, eventually evolved into Bethlehem Steel.
And when did they start moving over to where Bethlehem Steel is today, or the Bethlehem the land we know as Bethlehem
I think
Steel?
it was about 1920. In the mid 1920s, sometime they bought the property over there and moved over to that, you know, from the small, because the shops for the railroad company were small. They were just small buildings. They had no expansion room, so they wanted to expand their operations. So, and of course, all these iron and steel industries in 1893 were all pretty well done in by the tariffs that the government put out, and a lot of them went into receivership, like the Pottstown Iron Company went into receivership, and so did the bridge works at that time. But they the Pottstown Iron Company didn't really survive too well after that, but the bridge works came back. Glasgow Iron was big here, started in 1875 out at Glasgow. They continued on. The bridge works went into receivership, but they were reorganized and they came out of it. And of course they became Bethlehem Steel.
So besides iron and steel fabrication, what other industries started to evolve in Pottstown?
Well, you had Ellis Keystone Agricultural Works down on Cross Street. That was started in the 1860s by John Ellis and Nathan Hoffman, who were inventors of the thrasher for farming. It was drawn by horse, and they started over in East Coventry. Of course, John Ellis was known as the Bard of East Coventry. He was really well known over there. But together they invented this thrasher, and then in 1875 they moved their operation from Coventry over to Cross Street. And their thrashers were sold all over the USA and Europe and South America. They went everywhere. Wherever they farmed, they went. They were well known, and they had a good salesman, I guess, because it takes a good salesman to sell it. So they had a salesman going all over the world selling their thrasher. And in 1886 was their best year. They sold the most in 1886, and they brought in about $30,000 worth of new business, which in that year, $30,000 was a lot of money in today's standards. Of course, when the automobile came, the tractor came in, the horse-drawn thrasher kind of went out. But of course, they were bought over in 1893 by another party who continued to make the thrasher, but also brought out a peanut harvester. And then, you know, after World War I, they had to start changing their operation over because there was no need for a horse-drawn equipment anymore. And they didn't, evidently they never really kept up with the modern times. So, and of course we had the Chadwick, which started over there just south of the railroad, South Washington and South Street. They built a plant there to begin with in 1907. Then in 1912 they moved their
This is a luxury automobile?
That was a luxury automobile, $6,000 and some dollars. And the thing that brought them to an end was that Chadwick would not do assembly line. He built handmade cars. And of course Henry Ford brought about the assembly line, and that kind of did in Chadwick. He would not change his ways. But he built a plant over there on Keim Street in 1912 to expand the business. And you know, by 1916 he was out of business.
And what's that building used for now?
I'm not sure the buildings are there anymore, but Spicer took them over when they came into town.
And how did we evolve from cars into making car parts and truck parts?
Well, Spicer was probably the first one in here. There might have been some others. I'm not sure. I'd have to research that. I know there was quite a few of them, quite a few different ones. We had U.S. Axle that came in. We had New England Auto Parts. There was several that came into town. And of course, light manufacturing eventually started die casting aluminum parts for cars and stuff. They started out with bicycles. They started out in a building in an alley on Walnut Street, and then they went over to Union, what we know as Union Street. A lot of people don't know what Union Street is. It's like an alley now. But it's behind the old library, or the library now actually. And but Spicer, I guess, started it. They were here pretty early, like 1916 they came here, and they bought the buildings of the Chadwick company. That's how they started. And then of course they added on and added on and added on. There's several add-ons through the history of the company. You know, the Sawtooth buildings that we see along Keim Street were all added in there. I don't know. I tried to figure out if the Chadwick building was still in there, but I don't believe it. I believe if it is, they built all around it, and you just don't see it anymore. But that's basically how the car parts started, through those businesses.
So from Chadwick, we started getting a lot of manufacturers of car parts.
Right.
And we also got into manufacturing clothing, did we not?
Yeah, there was a lot of clothing. It's hard to go through them. There was Leibowitz, I guess it was. They started down, a lot of them started down in what was the foundry down on York and Walnut Street, where we see the foundry buildings. They started in the buildings around there. One I believe was the carriage business of Van Buskert there. Their buildings are all grouped together there at Walnut and York. And a lot of your shirt manufacturers and sock manufacturers and things like that started there. Some of them started over in South Pottstown. There's so many. I mean, you could do an article just on clothing manufacturers. I mean, Root down on High Street at 221, he had a shirt factory on the upper floors of his building. He sold men's clothing on the first floor, but the second floor he actually had a shirt factory up there that he made shirts. And he had a lot of machines and women working up there. Then of course there were Leibowitz built the building down there on Charlotte Street, the 5-story building that we're trying to get sold now, I guess, in the town, the borough here. And then there was another outfit that had the warehouse there in Beach Street that they built, but I'm trying to think, I'm off the top of my head, I can't remember what shirt company that was. That was a shirt company. They had started down at York and Walnut and then built that building then also. So, everywhere you look, like the Security Trust building, the upper floors, a lot of the time they had people in there manufacturing socks and shirts and pants. And also in the arcade building, the upper floor, a lot of times there were shirt manufacturers in there. Back on Plum Street, where they just built the new houses, there used to be a factory there where they made socks. Then you had Vaughan Knitting, and you had Hunter out in Stowe. All these were major manufacturers in town of making clothing.
And Vaughan Knitting is now the community college.
That is there at High and Manatoni Street. They started out. They had one right behind High and Penn, 236. Right behind there, they had a big 3-story building back there, which was a major fire in town. And then after the fire, they built the building out there at High and Manatoni. And of course, Kiwi Shoe Polish came in there and took that over. They bought one part, then they expanded, and then then they leased out where Kiss was, or yeah, Kiss. I guess I can say where Kiss was.
Yes.
They leased that out when they took over. They took over a shoe polish, not a shoe polish. Yeah, I guess it was another polish company, Cavalier. They bought out, and they had to expand. And of course, they tore a lot of the brewery buildings down, because that's where the Pottstown Brewery sat there. And when Kiwi took it over, they needed parking, so they eventually started tearing down the brewery buildings one at a time for parking.
So it was a brewery, then it was knitting mills.
Well, the brewery actually sat where the parking lot is,
right
next to the knitting.
Right.
What was the knitting mill?
So the site was a brewery, then it was knitting mills, then it was
it was a
shoe
hotel.
polish.
It was a hotel before that. It was the Red Lion Hotel, one of the oldest hotels in the town. Went back to the 1700s, and that sat right there. But it faced a different way because the road used to go different. The roads were different back in the 1700s. High Street, wasn't really the main street at that time.
So you mentioned the Bear Arcade is doing some manufacturing in the upper floors. That's to me a fascinating building. What was the history of the Bear Arcade?
Well, that used to be a house there, a beautiful house with 2 lions sitting out front. Trying to think of the name that was in there. He was an attorney or something like that. I can't think of his name right now.
Right,
anyway,
High in Charlotte.
High in Charlotte, and we have pictures of the front and the backyard of that house. And of course, then they bought the property. An investment group bought the property, tore it down. They had a big to-do when they tore it down. They sold off parts of the house and stuff like that, and the band was there playing. But anyway, the investment group, they started by building the stalls for the farmers. That's how they started it.
As a farmer's market.
Yeah, they just built the back section. Then
This is about when, do you know?
about 1902, 03, something like that. And then after that, after they got that started, then they built the front part that we know and it wasn't an arcade at that time. It was just it was called the Auditorium Building. And when they built this, they went broke. It was so expensive that the investors went broke. Eventually it went to Faroe.
And what did the Auditorium Building have? Does it have like 4 stories or 3?
There was a theater. It had a movie theater in there and offices. It was offices, a movie theater, and the farmer's market. Then Faroe took it over. Faroe bought it, the box company people. He bought it in the 30s. I guess, maybe the 20s. Yeah, he bought it in the 20s. And he's the one that made the arcade. It used to have the opening on the corner. He took that, he closed that off, and he built what we know as the arcade in the center there, the tunnel, like where all the businesses went in. So, but then eventually Barr is the guy that bought it, and that's how we know it as the Barr Arcade. And he had his he was an insurance man, and also he was involved in the aircraft industry and the auto industry. He was very heavily involved in that. He actually died in that building. He was fixing the antenna up on the roof, and he slipped and fell through the skylight of the building and died. So, but his widow continued on all the investments that he had.
And then that was sold off and torn down.
Sold off, torn down for parking. That was a thing, I guess, in the 70s. They figured to bring people back to town, they had to make parking. They could have picked another building, I would think, than that one.
So how about the evolution of what we know as downtown Pottstown? What were some of the major merchants that popped up?
Well, of course, we know Weissenskorn. It's been there a long time. They owned the property probably back into the 1870s, but the actual building they're in is built in 1888. They added on to the property. I guess it was his brother Solomon had a shoe store there right next to it. They kind of intermingled there. Some of the major ones, George Harrison, he had a millinery store at 207 where the China Pan is now. He built that building. We had Mosheim at, what is that, 211 I think he was at. And he was also into automobiles. He not making them, but in selling them. He was one of the first of the automobile salesmen in the early days of the automobile. And at that time they sold the automobiles off the street, right on the street. They didn't have showrooms like we have today. They would park them right along the curb, and people would look at them and say, I want that one, and then they would order them from the factory and they would come in. And he was involved with Krause and Ludwig, which eventually became that. And let's see, who else was there? There was Boyer Shoes, or Bunnings. Bunnings are a fabulous family to talk about. He's built that building in 1864. It's one of the oldest in
And the
town.
Bunning building is where?
That's the Argento's restaurant now. He learned his trade from Stenton, the hat man. He was a hatter. He eventually sold hats and men's clothing there. He died fairly early. His widow carried on. She built the back end of that in 1888. The interesting thing to me was his one son, Isaac Newton Bunning. He went west, as they said, go west, young man. He went west. He settled in Grand Junction, Colorado, which Rose and I visited out there, saw his house, saw his portrait out there. He became the editor and owner of the local newspaper, the Sentinel, and he also became mayor of the town. And it would be quite an undertaking, because you got to remember he went out there in the 1860s. It was wild and woolly at that time. And he more or less evolved that town into what it is today. So who else we have? We have the Shaners, who had it was a millinery, and it was a dry goods store. And that went for years and years. It evolved with different partners, but it was the Shaners for a long time. And before them, there was John Andre, who owned that building at 235 there on the corner of High and Penn. Andre was a very instrumental in the town also. He was a Burgess. He owned a lot of property all on that end there. He had a band that he organized called Andre's Cornet Band. He wrote music for the band and for other bands. And he was but he was another one that died early. But his widow carried on, and she's the one that built 233 next door. He built 235. She built 233, which became Bechtel's Sports Shop that we know of. But there was others in there. And
You can't forget Ellis Mills.
can't forget Ellis Mills. That started out as the Beecher store at 223. Beecher came here in the 1840s when the railroad came in. He worked as a clerk for a little bit, then he started his own business. 1850 he built 223 High Street. Then it evolved into his sons and his nephew. And of course the disastrous fire of 1890 leveled a lot of buildings on that block. And the Beechers bought additional properties. They not only had 223, but they bought 225 and 227, which we see today as the one building as Ellis Mills. In 1899, the Beechers got out of the business and they sold it to Ellis Mills. Now, Ellis Mills was in town before that. He was at a couple other locations.
Now this is a man, his first name was Ellis and his last name was Mills.
That's right, that's correct. And he was at 239 High Street at the time. He bought the building off of them. He was in business here for at least 10 years at that point. So, and then, but it was the Beechers that actually expanded that building into what it is. Ellis Mills took it over, and of course Ellis Mills was a staple in Pottstown all the way up until what, 1984, I believe. And Root, he was quite a character. He was born in Coventry, Root's Corner. A lot of Mount Zion Cemetery is from the Root family, the ground, the property. He came to Pottstown, started businesses, little businesses. Then he bought 221 High Street for his men's clothing store. And like I said before, he had the dress factory upstairs in the upper 2 floors. He was also involved in Mill Park, the fairgrounds. He was administrator in the fairgrounds. He was also director of banks in town, the Citizens Bank and all that. At one time he was arrested at the fairgrounds for selling liquor there. You couldn't sell liquor there, so he had kind of a colorful past too. He was also postmaster of Pottstown when they built the post office in 1916. And I have a picture of him with the Masons in uniform laying the cornerstone for the post office. So he was into a lot of things. He was very, very prominent man in town, very good businessman. Unfortunately, his sons were not.
Well, now what's the evolution of what we would now call New York Plaza?
That was the Hoffman family. I'm thinking it was, I want to say Nathan Hoffman, but I'm not sure of the first name without looking. But he had like 7 sons, I believe it was. I did do an article on that, but I did that article a while back. I can't remember all of it. But he had 7 sons, and they kind of took over when he retired. And they started out at various places. They came here around the turn of the century, 1900, and started out in various places. They were on the corner of High and Charlotte, where the Strand Theater was, where Elastic Carpet is now. They spent time there, but then they had to move out of there, of course, when they decided to build the Strand Theater. So in 1922, he moved and he bought 244. He's another one that expanded. They kept buying properties there, 244, 238, 236. You know, they started, and that's how they expanded the plaza. If you took that facade off, you'd find 3 brick buildings behind it. similar to what they did up there at Levitt's. You know, they bought properties aside and expanded out and took like three or four properties up there.
So the Hoffmans, once again, they ran a clothing store and a mini department store, I guess,
Yeah,
right up through the
they
70s.
They went from a men's and ladies apparel store to they sold almost everything from what I remember going in there. I know they were very big with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts at selling their uniforms and things like that, because I bought my Scout uniform there. Well, I didn't, my dad did. But yeah, that evolved, and the Hoffmans eventually, sold out, and I guess Bob McKinney bought the building then, and he had it for quite a few years. And I guess he kept the New York store there for a while, but then that went away. Of course, just like everything else, the malls took out the businesses in town, and now the malls are being taken over by online buying.
So the major stores on High Street there were a number of department stores. Pomeroy's had one here at one point.
Pomeroy, Penny's was actually over on the south side for a long time. W.T. Grant's for 20 some years was in the old Van Buskard building there. And of course, McCory's was in the Bernhardt building, the brownstone building on the north side. That's where McCory started. They were there for 20 some years till they built their building up there on the 300 block. I remember going to McCory's 5 and Dime. I remember going to Woolworth's. We had Woolworth's, then Woolworth's moved to the North End when they built the shopping center in the North End. They moved out there. Grant's moved to the West End shopping center where Ollie's is. And
there was a Sears downtown, wasn't there?
Sears was downtown. That was right off of Penn and High there. They built that. They were there for probably 30 years. And then, of course, Faroe leased them the property and built the farm store there where Sherwin-Williams is. Faroe, they had the box company there at South Street. Well, they bought all the property all the way up to the railroad eventually, the Faroe brothers. And so they leased it and built the building for Sears. And they had their farm store there and their regular store on High Street. Then, of course, the mall came about in the early 60s, and Sears moved over there.
And wasn't there a locally owned department store on the south side of High Street? Had a spectacular fire.
What am I thinking of? Success? Not Success. There was a Success department store.
Kessler's?
Well, Kessler's was a men's store. It wasn't so much a department store as he had a men's store, and then I think he went into a ladies apparel store. Yeah, that was a major fire up 264, 266 High Street. And of course then he moved, he was involved in a couple fires, I believe, because he moved over down to the 200 block then, and that's when Robbins Card fire happened down there in 218 and burned out that section of the block, and that's where Kessler's took their store there. And of course that's all one story. The two fires that I'm talking about, instead of having the 3-story brick buildings now, they have 1-story steel structures there. That's what they built after the fires. So yeah, the Success store was that was a department store. That was at 216, 214 High Street, and that was there for quite a few years. They eventually sold out. He eventually sold out to the Levitt's people for that property. and then some of it was taken down in the fire.
So, you want to talk a little bit about Pottstown's expansion, about how it started out in what's now the downtown and moved north and east?
Well, right after the war is when the North End started expanding. I'm in the papers in '62, and they're just putting the shopping centers in. The North End Shopping Center is just being started. The West End Shopping Center is just being started. The one out there in South Pottstown, where the roads converge, the suburban shopping center, that's just coming about. All these shopping centers are being built all at the same time. And the North End, all through the 50s, homes and apartment buildings are going up like crazy out in the North End. So much so that they were running out of water out there. And that's when they built the tower that we see on top of the hill there above the YMCA. They had to build that tower to get water out for the North End people because they didn't have enough pressure out there. And also that brought about, seeing that was built up so fast, it brought zoning issues up. The borough, they were building houses, but they weren't building streets and curbs. The borough was supposed to do that. So that brought about some of the zoning issues as far as, developers building streets and curbing now, instead of having houses sitting there on dirt streets.
I believe really there were a lot of dirt streets in the 30s, for example, in Pottstown.
Yeah.
And I think King Street was dirt when you got past Route 100. Was that originally Shoemaker Road? What was the road there that evolved into
There
Route
was no
100?
road there. I just read through that. Route 100, the 100 bypass originated, they were talking about it in the 50s already, but it didn't come to flourishing until almost the very late 50s. They finally started building it, and actually they were going to build that existing bridge that we see on High Street further west at Gable Avenue, but there was such a stink about that from everybody that they moved it this way. But it still took out a lot of houses, because see, they just got done building houses in there west of Pottsgrove Manor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and these houses were right in the way.
So they built houses and then tore them down again.
Yep, they tore them down. A farm out in the Coventry was tore down. Businesses along High Street had to give up their property. It was eminent domain, They gave a fair market price, and you gave up your property. But there was a lot of controversy over building 100 through here, the bypass. And of course, that included King Street with the state. The state owned King Street to the Manatoni Bridge, along with the bypass at that time. I don't know if they still do or not. I'm not sure about that. But at that time, they were responsible for the King Street, because they widened it and stuff like that. But the bypass was much needed because there was a lot of congestion with the 100 coming through Pottstown.
Well, prior to Route 100, if you were going from south of Pottstown to north, how did you
You came
do it?
through New Berlinville, over through Colebrookdale, through Halfway House, and on in on Farmington Avenue, crossed the Hanover Street Bridge,
So,
and went out, and you caught it out there at where Suburban Shopping Center is.
so South Hanover Street in North Coventry Township was the main route north.
That was the
And
main
you
route.
came through Pottstown,
Right through
got onto
Pottstown.
Farmington, continued up towards, as you said,
Halfway.
Bechtelsville and
Yep.
so forth. So Route 100 was a bypass, but didn't really totally bypass Pottstown. It cut off about a third of it.
Right. Yeah, it took a lot of properties out And of course they had to build several bridges, one over Manatoni Street, and the main one was the bridge across High Street, and it had to go over the railroad, and it had to go over the river, and so it was quite a, they had to sink holes. They had to come in and sink holes to find out where they were going to build this bridge, because it had to have good ground to set the pillars on. But they did it in sections. They did that section first through town. Then they did the Coventry out there to where it joins the old 100. And then in the early 60s, now they're working on going to Boyertown. That wasn't done yet. They only went up to State Street as far as that. That's as far as they went, the first section. Then they had to go from State Street on out, and boy, then there was a lot more controversy over property being taken away, because that was all farms and open land out that way.
So what we know is the North End happened after the Second World War.
Yeah, there was all fields out there. I mean, like the North End Shopping Center, Warren Zern, the builder, he had a farm right where that shopping center is. They bought his farm to build that shopping center. And also, they had to buy, I'm trying to think, what is it? There was 2 or 3 farms they had to buy up for that North End Shopping Center. And farms, there was farms all over the North End that were bought. Some of it was, along Charlotte Street it was bought up earlier, but we're talking above the high school, and out that way, Mervine, Master, and all that. There was a few houses here and there maybe, but the big rush came after the war.
And how about the east end of High Street? The Hill School comes along in the 1850s, but east of the Hill School there really wasn't anything.
At that time, in 1851, the town boundary was Adams Street. That was it. After that, you were out of the borough. There was farms out there. The Mincers had farm out there. The Hobarts had farms out that way. The Lairds had a farm out that way. The Laird farm sat where the Memorial Hospital, the old Memorial Hospital stands. Then there was ball fields where we see McDonald's and Subway and all that. Those were all ball fields. That's where everybody played ball. There was a hotel there where Rosedale Drive is. That wasn't there. There was a hotel out there called the Blind Tavern, East End Hotel. And they owned all that property all the way to the river and all. And they sold the land off for the St. Aloysius Cemetery. And then a syndicate came in there from Philadelphia and they bought up a lot of that property. But the Van Buskerts owned a lot of the property in the East End. And, houses went up. William Grubb, light manufacturing, he bought property, built his house there at High and Mount Vernon. Sailor, Pottstown Machine Company, bought the other corner. Dr. Eck bought where the Memorial Hospital is now. You can really see it with the trees now gone. You can see his mansion sticking out on top of the old Memorial Hospital. That's where he tore down the farm and built his mansion there. So, but that was earlier. It was the 1890s and the very early 1900s where they were building out there, building that way. But of course, in the 50s, the Nagel Center was bought. A lot of your auto dealerships moved to the East End. That's what mostly went that way. The auto dealerships ended up going out to the East End. There was a bunch of them, numerous ones that went out there. And of course, Howard Johnson's. I don't know how many people remember Howard Johnson's out there where the Wawa is.
That was a Howard Johnson?
That was a Howard Johnson's until about 62. They tore the Howard Johnsons down and built an A&P, well, it might have been an Acme, but I think it was an A&P store they built. And then, of course, Superfresh took that over. And then after Superfresh, Wawa came in there and built. Yeah, it's changed a lot. It has changed along there. But the Firestone store was there since the 50s. I remember playing where the hospital is. That was nothing but a vacant lot. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but Stanley Swinehart was going to build a big shopping center where that hospital is. He had plans made up, architect and everything, and he had it all figured out about building a shopping center in there. And then I don't know what happened. It never came to be into being. I remember it vacant all the way. I played in there all the way in the 50s and 60s, and it was nothing but red shale. I remember.
Well, do I recall correctly that Stanley Swinehart was responsible for a lot of the Rupert area development housing out there?
He built most of the homes on Queen, South, Cherry, and Maple. And he, by the way, now that we mention him, he also had a dress company out of his building, the building where he had his office on Maple Street next to the tennis courts. That was a dress factory, and he ran it, and then he sold it. And of course that became Mr. Trio later on. Bowden, who we didn't mention in the dress factory business, he really expanded. I mean, there's a man that started with nothing, William Bowden, mortgaged his home to the hilt to start that dress factory where the Sunset Manufacturing Company was, that little farmhouse, and eventually built that, well, there's nothing much in it now, but that building there on Moser Road, that factory. And plus he went into that one up on Maple Street, and Howard and Sixton Johnson, the big the dress factory that was up there, he turned that into another one. He also took over the Wilkie Furniture Company building. He had places everywhere that he was making these uniforms. He was big making these. Well, when I worked for him, it was mostly dresses, but then he got into uniforms, making nurses' uniforms and stuff like that. And that's what really expanded.
So just really one developer did a lot to create what we would now call the Rupert area.
He also built Sunrise Lane. He also built the house, a lot of the houses there around Cherry Lane and Sunset Drive. Yeah, I'm not saying he built every house there, but he built a lot of them, you know. He was very nice. I don't know, I remember him as a very nice man. I used to go pay the bills when we rented at Sunrise Lane. I used to go up and pay the bill, and he'd talk to me for a little bit, and then I'd get a lollipop from him. And he was a nice guy to me. I thought he was nice. I don't know what he was like, but to me he was a nice man. And yeah, he's responsible for a lot of building on that end of town. He bought up all the farms up that way, and he built a lot of structures out there. A lot of the places that the car dealers were at out there in the East End were built by him. They were built by Stanley, or they bought the property from Stanley to build on, one or the other. He leased some of them. He sold some of the property. He leased some of the property. So.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the, I don't know if you do or not, about how we got into treating water and sewage, and how we got into putting pipes in the borough, building up the infrastructure?
Well, the reservoir up there in Washington Hill was there for many, many years. I mean, that goes way back to the 1800s, the original one. Now, of course, they have a new one there now, but that old cement one went back a long ways. And of course, they had the one out there on Burke Street by the airport. Those were the two main reservoirs. They had a pumping station at one time down at South Washington Street at the river. I'm trying to think when the water treatment plant came in. The sewer plant, I remember that in the 1950s, the state really got tough on them, on the sewage plant. They had a sewage plant already, but it wasn't up to standards of what the state wanted, so they had to make many improvements. It cost the borough a lot of money to update their sewage plant in the 50s.
It's always been located where it is now?
Yeah, it's been there. And the water treatment plant's pretty much always been out, for a long time it's been out there in West Pottsgrove. Of course, we had early in the 1850s, we had the gas company, which was locally run. We had the electric company, which was locally run. Everything was pretty local until the 1900s is really when a lot of that changed, when you started seeing other bigger concerns coming in and taking over. We owned the electric plant for a long time there, and then PECO took, Philadelphia Suburban came in and took it over. That became PECO. And they built that plant, which is now the building for the bike.
For the Schuylkill River Heritage Center.
You're right,
the community college.
Yes.
So that was the electric plant.
Yes.
So that goes back a long time. It was local.
1912 is when that was built.
And was that actually a generating plant at one time?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. That was. Yep. The gas company sat right along the railroad, on the south side of the railroad. We have pictures of that. Of course, gas sort of kind of went out after Edison got into the electric and all that. And that's what started a lot of our second shift work in the plants here by the 1880s. Most of them were had electric put in, and they started working 2 shifts. Then they could work at night. But of course, the hospitals came about because of industry. The industry that we had out there along West High Street, along the river, there were several of them there. There was like 7 in a row going out, ending with Columbia Boiler and out in that area. But men were getting hurt. I mean, feet were getting crushed, arms were taken off, gashes in legs and stuff. And all we had at the time was doctors, local doctors. So that's what brought about the hospital. They put out a referendum to build a hospital. William Achenbach was a big person. He had a grocery business here in town. He was very big in getting that done. And he had a man in Philadelphia that would match funds. Whatever funds the borough could come up with, this man in Philadelphia would match them. And that's how we got our hospital built out in the North End.
Oh, the North End, the Pottstown
North End was
hospital.
the first hospital.
That was first.
Yes.
And none of that building is around anymore, is it?
No, that sat where the parking lot is now for the Manor Care. That parking lot was the hospital. And of course, then in 1914 they started the Memorial Hospital, and then they were merged. When they built the new hospital, they were merged.
So is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up?
There's probably plenty we haven't talked about that we should bring up, but I can't think of any more right now. Maybe we'll make it another session.